Okay. So we have 3 points of inquiry on the table. What was the thesis? What is Glissant up to with the abyss metaphor? And then what questions you guys may have had about the reading as a whole? Who wants to kind of talk about what was discussed in your breakout rooms?
So for question number one, me and Emily, we both agreed that the answer for the first question is the Glissant's main thesis is the fighting for survival because they did went through unknown things and future changes in the knowledge.
Okay. The element of survival or resiliency is another way of putting that. Absolutely. Gabriel?
Hi. So in our group, we, pretty much kind of touched on everything. But one of the questions we found most interesting was, what is the purpose of the abyss, right?
Mm-hmm.
And in not only that, but defining what the abyss was, because in our group, we were trying to figure out whether or not the abyss, or not figure out, but I'm sure it was both, but whether the abyss was the creolization of the West, like this new identity of what like this new idea of what Black is, or if the abyss was also, because there were some parts in the passage to me that were very like interesting, was because even though I felt like the abyss was definitely like for I wish I had a better metaphor, but like the sunken place, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's where like this your old whoever you were is done away with, and now there's this new version of who you are, and you're in this abyss of places. And I didn't know if the abyss was, it was hard for me to see if the abyss was the place where you are when your identity had been taken away from you, or if the abyss was the new identity. So that was something we kept going back and forth on, and I think we still are more.
Yeah, I think you guys are like really teetering around what Glissant is interpreting the abyss to be, and then once I go into my notes, you'll really get a clearer understanding of how he's using that abyss. Who else wants to add to?
Can I say what I thought the
Yeah,
abyss
yeah,
was?
please.
So I thought the abyss was like their fate, how they were African people, they were enslaved only to go on a ship, to go to a place, to become enslaved again. And I thought that the abyss was just how they practically had no future since they had no freedom. So I thought the abyss was like nothingness. Oh, I'm
I
done.
didn't mean to cut you off, Nick. But doesn't he also talk about the unknown? And he talks about the what is the unknown? Yep. And that's what I thought was kind of more or less for his
And you're both right, because he does say that the abyss is the unknown, but then he goes into more details to articulate how the abyss manifests itself in these different formations of the unknown. So you're both right, and again, we'll really unpack that a little bit more. Let me ask you guys this, and we'll kind of trace this back to question one. What is he talking about? What is this whole open boat passage? What is he articulating? What picture is he painting?
It's transfer of slaves. I mean, enslaved people.
Right? Yeah, the transatlantic enslavement experience. This is what he's articulating. So I hope everyone understood that. It's very metaphorical, but that's his overall his thesis is what the transatlantic experience did to African people and how it forces them, or how it forced them to form new relations. That's really what he's getting at. Anyone else want to add to what was discussed in their breakout rooms? Even what questions they may have had about the reading? All right, so we'll jump into my notes then. This is the book that we pulled the excerpt from. As I mentioned earlier, it's entitled Poetics of Relation. The author is Edward Glissant. He is a Martinican poet, intellectual, philosopher from Martinique, the Caribbean. He was trained in France, so he's a Caribbean thinker who was trained in the French intellectual tradition. This book was originally written in French. It's translated by Betsy Wang, so there is a translation that takes place. Think about what Malidoma Patrice May says when things happen in translation, right? There's a certain violence that takes place. So we have to understand that there was a violence that has been done to Glissant's work for it to be translated from French to the English language, okay? So he says, I'm gonna read the opening passage, and then there's like a little asterisk on the opening passage that kind of points you to go to the bottom of the page. So we'll deal with that. For the Africans who lived through the experience of deportation to the Americas, confronting the unknown with neither preparation nor challenge was no doubt petrifying. And then so after he says coming to the deportation to the Americas, he gives you that little asterisk, right? And so if you follow that asterisk to the bottom of the page, he gives you a whole nother passage to kind of provide more details to what he's talking about, right? Because if you hear the deportation to the Americas, that sounds vastly different from being kidnapped, brought over in chains to the Americas, right? It sounds like a different type of exchange. But he says under the asterisk, right, the slave trade came through the cramped doorways of the slave ship, leaving a wake like that of crawling desert caravans. It may be drawn like this. And he has like a line with two things branching out at the end. African countries to the east, the lands of the Americas to the west. This creature is the image of a fabril. And in the next paragraph, African languages become deterritorialized, right? So they get placed out of their territory, right? So if you're in Ghana and you speak the Akan language, through this deportation, that language gets picked up from Ghana and gets transported to the Americas. If you're in Nigeria and you speak Igbo, through that deportation, your language gets picked up from Nigeria and gets transported to the Americas, right? This is the most completely known confrontation between the powers of the written word and the impulses of orality, okay? And the orality is just the ability to express verbally, right? It could be shouting, it could be speaking, it could be hip hop, it could be poetry, right? It could be beatboxing. This is this notion of orality. The only written thing on the slave ship was the account book listing the exchange values of the enslaved. Within the ship's space, the cry, okay, that cry is the orality that he's speaking of those deported was stifled. What does it mean to have your cry stifled? What does stifling mean? Go ahead.
Stop.
Yep.
Restraint.
Yep, to be stopped, to be muted, to be restrained, right? So he says that cry was stifled, as it would be in the realm of the plantation, right? So when they go through one form of the abyss, and then they arrive at these plantations, that cry will still be stifled, okay? This confrontation still reverberates to this day. So there's a multiplicity of confrontations at play within this passage, right? The first confrontation is between the oral and the written, right? The oral being the cries that came out of the Africans' mouths that become stifled. The written being the ledger that documents the value of each individual captured and placed on the boat, right? This is the first confrontation. Then he says the stifling will continue on the plantation, right? So there's another confrontation at place, right? So once you get on this American soil and you still seek to promote these cries, or you still seek to use your orality, that will continue to be stifled, right? And then the third confrontation, the confrontation of the stifling of orality still today, right? How does that play out? That plays out today when you hear things like Africans have no written tradition, right? When you hear African people try to articulate or express their plight, and the powers that be don't want to hear it, right? It's the stifling of those cries. So let's get into the abyss, because he says that there's three versions of the abyss. And he says, what is terrifying partakes of the abyss, three times linked to the unknown. So that goes to Gabriel's point about the abyss being likened to the unknown. He says that very clearly on page 6, the first full paragraph, right? First, the time you fell into the belly of the boat, right? So this is the first abyss, going into the belly of the boat. 4, in your poetic vision, a boat has no belly. A boat does not swallow up, does not devour. A boat is steered by open skies. Yet, the belly of this boat dissolves you, participates you into a non-world from which you cry out. This boat is a womb abyss. It generates the clamor of your protest. It also produces all the coming anonymity. Although you are alone in this suffering, you share in the unknown with others whom you have yet to know, right? So think about the experience of being snatched from your homeland, right? Being put into this belly or this abyss, this unknown, right? And then you realize that you're chained to others who you also don't know. But you share a commonality because you're both in this abyss. Okay. The next abyss. So it's the second phase of the abyss. This is still on page 6, the subsequent paragraph. The next abyss was the depths of the sea. Whenever a fleet of ships gave chase to a slave ship, it was easiest just to lighten the boat by throwing cargo overboard, weighing it down with balls and chains. These underwater signposts mark the course between the Gold Coast and the Leeward Islands. So what is he describing here? What's happening in the second abyss? How do you get to the depths of sea? What happens? So we know that there's a chase ensuing, right? These fleet of ships are chasing the enslaved ships. So they know to lighten the load, it's easiest to discard cargo. What is that cargo? What is the ships transporting?
African people.
Slaves. Oh.
African people, right? So the second abyss is when these boats are being chased and they need to lighten the load so they could maneuver faster. So they dump the cargo or they dump African people at the bottom of the ocean with ball and chains to make sure that they get to the bottom of the ocean, right? And he says, these underwater signposts, these signposts are actually people, right? And they mark the course between the Gold Coast, which is the west coast of Africa, to the Leeward Islands, which is in the Western Hemisphere, right? So he says you could if you were underwater, what this is trying to get you to imagine, right? If you're underwater, and just how we have freeways with signs, right? The 10 will tell you Crenshaw, La Brea, Fairfax, etc., right? He's saying you could go on the Atlantic Ocean, and as you travel through the Atlantic Ocean, you will have signposts of dead bodies of African people who were thrown overboard that will allow you to navigate your way from the west coast of Africa to the eastern coast of the Americas, right? This is what he's telling you. So that's abyss number 2. The third abyss. The third abyss is all that gets left behind, right? All that has been left behind not to be regained for generations, right? So all that memory that was left in Africa, that's that third abyss, right? And I'll take you back to the interview that we watched last week with Ryan Coogler, and he says, well, shit, although this heinous thing happened to us, they cannot stop us from being African, right? So even though they try to place us in that third abyss where we don't remember our African names, our African languages, our African customs, right? There's ingenuity there that allows us to remain connected, although they try to sever that memory for us. So those are the 3 phases of the abyss, right? They all operate under the unknown. but we know that the first is the belly of the boat or the boat itself, right? We know that the second manifests under the water. And not only, so here's another thing too. Glissant doesn't talk about this, but yes, the cargo was thrown overboard. But oftentimes enslaved Africans would jump overboard to avoid the Americas because they didn't know what was coming. So they figured, you know what, I'd rather situate myself in this thing called death than to experience the death of enslavement, right? So the second abyss is the ocean, and then the final abyss is all that gets left behind in your transition to the new world. He said, feeling a language vanish, the words of the gods vanish, and the sealed images of even the most everyday object vanish, right? So all these things that make up your past, seeing that removed from you. That's that third abyss. And then this is where it kind of gets interesting. This is where, for me, you get the glimmer of hope, if you will, in this portion of the reading. He says the population that formed, people pay attention, the populations that then formed, despite having forgotten the chasm, despite being unable to imagine the passion of those who foundered there, nonetheless wove this sail. They did not use this to return to their former land, but to rise up in this unexpected, dumbfounded land. So he says these Africans who are mixed together on the belly of the boat, right? From various different parts of Africa. Again, West Africa, Ghana, Nigeria, Senegal, right? Speaking all these varieties of different languages, right? They come together and they form a new population, a population that has the abyss in common, okay? They can't imagine what their new world will be like. But they formed sails, right? They formed a sail that wouldn't allow them to sail back to Africa, but allowed them to rise up in this new land where they knew nothing of. And he says, how, so then for me, the question is posed, how are they able to do so? He said there's a knowledge that allows them to rise up, okay? He says not just a specific knowledge, appetite, suffering, and delight of one particular people. Not only that, but knowledge of the whole, greater from having been at the abyss, and freeing knowledge of relation within the whole, okay? So the knowledge of the whole, to me, again, thinking about this relation, right? So yeah, I have knowledge of how life was in Ghana. You may have knowledge of how life was in Nigeria, but we're gonna think about the whole experience, right? We're gonna look at our experiences. We see, okay, we both in this abyss, right? But he says, the abyss and freeing knowledge, a knowledge of relation within the whole. So within this idea of the whole, right? Within this notion of relation, how we relate to one another, how we interact with one another, there's the freedom. This is how you can build and forge new populations in spite of all that you've gone through, okay? He says, for though this experience made you original victim, floating towards the sea's abyss, an expectation, it becomes something shared, and it made us, the descendants, one people among others. Peoples do not live on exception. Relation is not made up of things that are foreign, but of shared knowledge. Again, relation is not made up of things that are foreign, but of shared knowledge. So I'm not going to focus on things that separate us, but I'm going to focus on the things that that bring us together, right? This is this notion of relation. The experience of the abyss can now be said to be the best element of exchange. So because we've went through this abyss, that's that shared knowledge that we should focus on. That's the connection, that's the link that we have that would allow us to build community. Okay? And then he closes with this, and I found it to be interesting. He says, "This is why we stay with poetry." So let me read what he says before that. Then I'll close with that because I think you can't have one without the other. So bear with me as I read the previous paragraph. For us, and without exception, and no matter how much distance we may keep, the abyss is also a projection of a perspective into the unknown, right? So the abyss is a projection of and a perspective into the unknown. So again, going back to what Gabe was saying, when you think about this abyss, a large part of that is the unknown. Beyond its chasm, we gamble on the unknown. We take sides in this game of the world. We hail and renew indies. We are for it. And for this relation, made of storms and profound moments of peace, in which we may honor our boats. Okay? And then he says, this is why we stay with poetry. And despite our consenting to all the indisputable technologies, despite seeing the political leap that must be managed, the horror of hunger and ignorance, torture and massacre to be conquered, the full load of knowledge to be tamed, the weight of every piece of machinery that we shall finally control, and the exhausting flashes as we pass from one era to another, from forest to city, from story to computer, at the bow, there is still something we now share. This murmur, cloud or rain, or peaceful smoke, we know ourselves as part, as crowd, and an unknown that does not terrify. We cry our cry of poetry. Our boats are open, and we sell them for everyone. So he says poetry becomes useful, right? Because poetry becomes the best mechanism to articulate experience as such, right? Poetry gives you the freedom to manipulate words, right? Poetry allows you to play with language. Poetry uses metaphor, right? So he says, this is why we stay with poetry. Despite all the technology that we have, right? The computers and all these things, poetry becomes most useful. So those are my notes from the reading. What I do want to do, because I know this is a dense and opaque reading. Even after I delivered my notes, are there any questions that you guys just want to pose and kind of get answered before we transition into the fishbowl? Okay, no questions? So go ahead, Alyssa, go ahead.
I just, can you explain the thesis that you said one more time? I kind of got confused on it.
Yeah. Sorry. So the thesis really, so one, to understand the thesis, you have to understand what he's articulating, right? He's providing you a poetic account of this, the transatlantic slave experience, right? So being snatched up from your home, put into the bottom of a boat, and being transferred to the Americas to work the plantations, and all that comes along with that, right? But what Glissant is focused on is how that experience produced a newness, how it produced a new population that we now call African Americans, right? How it produces a language that we call Creole, right? So his thesis is really how this idea or this notion of relations can bring populations together to produce newness. Does that answer your question, Alyssa?
Yes, it does. Thank you very much.
Are there any other questions about Glissant's open boat text? All right, bet. So let's transition into our fishbowl. Again, if you went twice already, you're good for the semester. If you have passed, you've already used your pass, you have to go at least twice per semester. Is there anyone who wants to volunteer? Okay, Gabriel, I got you. And then Gabriel, let me know if this is your second time or not.
I think I'd like to volunteer as well.
Okay,
I'd like to. You.
Roki, okay, got you. Good, thank you. Anyone else? All right, we'll go with those three. Whoever wants to start is on you. Yeah,
I can start.
yeah, yeah.
It's up to you guys. Okay. Um. Okay. So, let me start. The open bow was a passage that I found very um, inspiring because the notion of poetry is something that's repeated throughout, and he really emphasizes it in the end, especially in the way that we're supposed to interpret it. So I think the experience of the abyss allows those individuals who had fallen victim to the creolization of the West, which is a term he also uses in a newfound strength. And I think that the strength passed down not through the physical, or rather this spiritual way that's inherent. And I think that when he says here on page 7, he goes, the unconscious memory of the abyss serves as the illusion for these metamorphoses. So even still, with these new definitions of what it is supposed to be, or what these individuals are constantly find themselves trying to, even still with this new idea of what the African is supposed to be, their inherent natures stay true throughout, and it allows them tools, and it manifests tools in order to rebuild. And that's why I found poetry, and that's why when he taps back into poetry and taps back into how poetry is used as a tool to bend the rules, it also allows and manifests itself the strength that was once taken from them.
And something I like to add on, I like how the author also did this with his own work, because in the first half, he highlighted the abyss as in a negative light. And something I like to bring up is he described the first abyss as a womb. And this was highlighting how it became natural for Africans to become enslaved people, how this was just what became normalized for them. And in the second half, the abyss was put under a different light, where he saw it as something that unified all of these people and formed a new connection with all of them, rather than just being an empty abyss where they had nothing to look forward to.
Real quick, I just want to jump in because Nick, what you articulated is what we call meta theory, okay? And what meta theory is, and I'm trying to think the best way to articulate this. So what Glissant is talking about in his writing, what he's writing about, right? He's doing that work with the writing. So as he's talking about the abyss and how it changes, he's writing how the abyss is changing. Does that make sense? So it's two things at play here, and Nick tapped on that perfectly. So the subject of his conversation, right, is the enslavement experience. And within the subject of that conversation, he articulates how the abyss changes, okay? So that's one level of operation. It's one level of theory at play. The meta theory comes into play is what Nick is saying is how Glissant, through his writing, manipulates the abyss. So initially, the abyss plays out as something that is negative, something that's damaging, something that is divisive. But then as Glissant moves through the text, he evolves the abyss into something that is the center of relation. So it shifts from something negative to something positive, right? In the way that he uses the abyss, and then also his articulation of what the abyss does, it shifts from something negative to something positive. So this becomes useful for you as thinkers and readers to be attentive to these moves, right? But also as writers, as you guys start to produce your written texts, as you continue your educational career, think of this notion of meta theory. You want to make sure that what you're doing with the subject matter that is your essay is also taking place in the subject matter that you're writing about. Does that make sense? This is a very, very good call out, Nick.
I'll go. There was this quote in the last, like page 8, where he's like, "For the this experience made you, original victim floating towards these abysses, an exception. It became something shared and made us the descendants, one people among others." It's just important to have someone to relate to. Like I think in the beginning he's talking about how they ripped them from their communities and everything, like they were that was safe for them, so now they have to make their own culture, or like similar culture that they had back there. And like almost at the end, he's like, relation is not made up of things that are foreign, but of shared knowledge. And I thought that was like very important.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to close this out. Thank you, Rocio. Um, I'm gonna give you guys, since we're dealing with metaphors. For me, the way that I think about not only this reading, but this book as a whole and a lot of Glissant's work and this idea of relations, I think about gumbo. Is anybody familiar with the dish gumbo? Anybody that had gumbo, heard about gumbo, or more importantly, know how gumbo is made? Anybody?
Isn't gumbo like it's like very traditional, but it's like leftover meat, right? And you put it all like it's like all the unwanted parts of meat.
Kinda. Historically, yes, that's how it was made. Really, historically, that's how all African descended people, well, Africans in America under the slave experience had to eat their food, from one. But it is right; it's a mashup, right? So one thing with gumbo that's fundamental is the broth, the roux, right? So how typically gumbo is made is you're gonna create that roux first. You're gonna create that broth first. You'll pour your seasonings into that broth, and you let that broth simmer, right? And that simmering allows all those seasonings and those flavors to kind of merge together and produce its own flavor. And then, as Gabriel points out, you pour the sausage in there, you pour the shrimp in there, you pour the crab legs in there, oysters, whatever as your heart desires, along with some rice, and then you let that sit and stew for another hour or so, right? And the sitting of all those flavors in one pot produces this flavor unto itself that we call gumbo, right? This is the Creole language. This is the Creole culture, right? For those anybody familiar with the New Orleans area, been to New Orleans or anything like that? Familiar with the culture of New Orleans? Very heavy Creole culture.
I have heard that for New Orleans, it's like something like, I don't know how to describe their culture, but I do have heard about it. And I have actually seen movies and stuff like that.
Yeah. So when you think about New Orleans culture, there's like a cultural confluence of French culture, what they'll say is Caribbean culture, right? There's like a tinge of Southern American culture, and really African culture, right? And African culture is influenced through the Caribbean culture. But all these things kind of merge together and produce Creole food, Creole language, right? So the Creole language is French, broken English, and traces of West African languages, right? So again, if you think about how this gumbo is made, the pouring together of all these different elements, all these different spices, all these different seafoods, and all these different meats, and the time that it takes for them to simmer, and then you produce newness, right? Think about the Western Hemisphere. How was the West made, right? You had indigenous people here, mixing cultures with African people, right? Europeans come in over, Spanish come over, the conquest begins, right? Rape, pillaging, etc., etc. But cultures begin to merge, whether it's forced or whether it's just through cultural confluence. And we produce this thing we call America, right? Over time. And we'll call it like a melting pot culture and things of this nature, right? But what Glissant is attentive to is how all these different meats from different parts of the world, all these different seafoods that come from different parts of the sea, all these seasonings can be put in one pot set over time, and a whole new dish can be produced. This is this idea, this is this notion of relations, right? How we could come together and produce anew. And that's where the focal point is. Um, Thank you guys for the fishbowl. I think you guys really hit on some very, very fundamental points. Let's open it up for the time left for an overall class discussion about the reading. I'm curious to hear other people's thoughts, comments, and concerns about the text. Let me ask you this: how does the gumbo metaphor serve your understanding of the reading? Does it help? Does it make it a little bit more confusing? What are your thoughts on that?
If I may, I know I've been talking a whole bunch. I love the metaphor. I think it's a really strong metaphor, but I also think it speaks for the resilience within the communities that are now jumbo, if that makes any sense.
Yeah.
Instead of choosing to focus on what could have been on the negative, or rather the current disadvantages, rather focusing on what is still around, I think is a very it just speaks volumes. Yeah. And I think that is how you build, and that is how you grow, that is how you surpass it.
Yeah. And I think also, Gabriel, if I could to piggyback on you, the importance, the attentiveness, and the focus on the production of something new, right? That's not only central for what Glissant is doing for African people as a whole, but for the Black intellectual tradition, this notion of producing the new becomes central. When you get into figures like Frantz Fanon, who's also from Martinique, where Glissant is from, actually, Glissant is an understudy of Fanon. When you get into individuals like Stuart Hall, who is a Jamaican who grew up in the UK, they get into this notion of producing the new human, right? The new type of human that is able to surpass the limitations of modernity. So this notion of newness becomes important, whether it's new language, whether it's the new individual, right? Whether it's a new culture as a whole, this idea of newness becomes central to the Black intellectual tradition. Other thoughts on the reading? Damien, what did you think about the reading and or the discussion? Damien?
I just thought it was different. I could really see how, I don't know, I just felt like it was similar to the other ones we read, but just that one issue of being westernized, and how you were talking about the gumbo part and stuff. I really liked how you used that as a metaphor.
Okay. Jessica, what are your thoughts on the reading or conversation?
I really like the idea that you said, how it all corresponds with the other readings about this shared experience that kind of brings us all in and kind of ties us all. And even though I said people were kind of from different places, they all shared that common experience, and it really helped. Yeah. I like that.
Jaime, you put in the chat this reading was difficult, a little hard, and you're right, man. I'm not, and I try to kind of preface that before I even gave you the guys the text, yo, take your time with this one. It's not going to be as straightforward as the previous text that we engaged. But Jaime, now that you kind of went through conversation, does it make a little more sense for you? Jaime? All right. Samina, what are your thoughts on the readings and or discussion?
I'm gonna have to type it in the chat because I'm in study hall.
Okay, no worries. Thank you. Dulce, how about you? What was your thoughts on the reading and or discussion?
I was kind of like Jaime. It was difficult, but when you give us your ideas and you wrote you sorry, you read your notes, I can understand better now.
Okay, cool. One thing I would encourage too, if time permits, because I know this semester is moving really quick, it may be a good idea to revisit this text now that you've had my notes and see if you could like glean a little bit more from the reading than what you originally interpreted when you first engaged the text. That may be a good idea as well. But as I mentioned, this really, I would say, a hardcore closeout on this idea or this conversation around relations. So I ended it with this reading on that on purpose, just so you guys could really understand concisely what we mean when we deal with this notion or this idea of relations, and how even through something as tragic as the transatlantic slave experience, you can produce something new that's beautiful as what we call Black culture, right? A culture that has become so pervasive, it often gets blurred with popular culture, right? I'm just checking out the chat. Give me a second. Yeah, definitely. Again, I would encourage, if you guys have the time, to do the reread. I try to, I think it's like my third time reading this book, and I have one more time to read it for my qual exams. But every time that I pick it up, I get something new from the text. Let me show you guys what your reading is for next week, and we'll call it a day. We're kind of shifting gears here as it pertains to the reading material. So now we're in weeks, and I can't believe we're already in week 8. This shit is moving so fast. Weeks 8 through 11. We're going into Zero Nell Hurston's Of Mules and Men, and then we'll be dealing exclusively with James Baldwin. What I do want to say about this text, I use it because it's a folklore text, but the way that it's written is very much in this broken English type of dialect. The setting is Kissimmee, Florida. I want to say early 1920s, right? So it's a very much of a broken dialect, and she writes in that manner as well. But it's just kind of give you an idea of how folklore and stories become generative for understanding the oral tradition as we move, onto American soil. So this is the text here. And again, you guys kind of see what I mean as far as the brokenness of the English. So it's not hard, but it's difficult to kind of navigate through that the way that it's written. Another book that you may want to read out loud, because when you hear what you're saying, it's going to kind of help it make more sense for you. I'll email that out to you guys by Thursday or Friday. Remember, you have the extra credit opportunity on the table. I'm giving you the whole semester to get that done, but it's going to be especially useful when thinking about what we just read for this week. If there's any comments, questions, or concerns, please don't hesitate to reach out to me. I'll be happy to set up office hours if need be.